The winter Caleb Rourke broke his own rule about strangers. He didn't know it would cost him everything he'd built, or give him everything he'd lost. Copper Hollow, 1872. A town dying slow in the mountains. A man who'd forgotten how to need anyone. And one frozen night that changed it all. This is their story, raw, brutal, and real. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. Now, let me take you back to when winter had teeth, and loneliness was a choice you made every single day. The snow came early that year. October hadn't even finished dying when the first real storm hit Copper Hollow, dumping 2 feet of powder across the high country and reminding everyone who'd gotten comfortable during the long summer that the mountains didn't give a damn about comfort. The storm blew through on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning the sky had cleared to that hard, bright blue that hurt to look at. The kind of sky that promised the cold wasn't going anywhere for months. Caleb Rourke rode into town that Wednesday with ice in his beard and frost on his coat collar. His horse, a gray gelding named Stub for the half-year he'd lost to frostbite 3 winters back, picked his way down the frozen main street with the careful steps of an animal that knew what black ice could do. Caleb sat loose in the saddle, his rifle across his lap more from habit than expectation. Nobody bothered him anymore, hadn't in years. The town looked smaller every time he saw it. Maybe it was actually shrinking, families pulling out when the mines played out, or the winters got too hard. Or maybe it was just that Caleb kept getting further away from the idea that places like this mattered. Either way, Copper Hollow in the weak morning light looked like what it was. A collection of weathered buildings clinging to existence in a valley that wanted them gone. He tied Stub outside Morrison's general store and stood for a moment on the boardwalk, letting his eyes adjust to being around structures again. 11 months, that's how long it had been since his last trip down. Longer than usual, but he'd stocked heavy last winter and the hunting had been good. No reason to come down until the supplies ran low and the passes started closing. The store smelled like coffee and lamp oil and the particular mustiness of a place that never quite dried out. Morrison was behind the counter, same as always, older now but not noticeably. As if he'd hit 60 and decided that was old enough, thank you, and stopped right there. Rourke. Morrison didn't look up from his ledger. Thought maybe you died up there. Not yet. Always next winter. Morrison wet his finger, turned a page. What do you need? Caleb had a list in his head. Flour, salt, coffee, sugar, powder, and shot. Lamp oil, beans, dried fruit. If Morrison had any that wasn't mostly rock, he ran through it while Morrison made notes with a stub of pencil, his handwriting small and precise, like a man who'd learned to make supplies stretch by writing small. Take me about an hour to get this together, Morrison said. You want to wait or come back? I'll wait. Suit yourself. Coffee's fresh if you want it. Caleb poured himself a cup from the pot on the stove and stood near the window, looking out at the street. A few people moved through the cold, heads down, wrapped in whatever they had. He didn't recognize most of them. New faces or faces he'd never bothered to learn. It didn't matter which. He was halfway through his second cup when he saw her. She was sitting on the steps of the building across the street, the old assayer's office that had been empty since the silver played out. Just sitting there in a dress too thin for the weather, no coat, no shawl, arms wrapped around herself like she could hold her own heat in through will alone. Her hair was dark, pulled back severe, and even from across the street Caleb could see the way her shoulders were set, not slumped in defeat, not hunched against the cold, but squared, braced. Who's that? He didn't mean to ask it out loud. Morrison glanced up, followed Caleb's gaze. Which one? The woman, on the steps. Morrison squinted through the window. Oh, that's nobody. Showed up a couple weeks ago on the stage. Been hanging around since. She got people here? If she does, they haven't claimed her. Morrison went back to his ledger. Some church ladies tried to help. She told them where to stick it, from what I heard. Pride and no sense. Bad combination. Caleb kept watching. The woman hadn't moved. Wasn't begging. Wasn't calling out to the few people who passed. Just sitting there like she had every right to that spot, and the cold could go to hell. She'll freeze, Caleb said. Probably. Morrison's pencil scratched across paper. But that's her business, not mine. I've got enough to worry about. Caleb drained his coffee, set the cup down harder than he meant to. He shouldn't care. Hadn't cared about another human being's problems in over a decade, and that approach had served him fine. The mountains didn't reward sentiment. Winter killed the soft and the stupid, and if this woman was too proud to accept help from people who actually knew how to survive here, that was natural selection doing its work. He told himself that while he crossed the street. The woman didn't look up when his shadow fell across her. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd thought, mid-20s maybe, but with the kind of worn look that came from hard miles, not hard years. Her face was thin, her hands were raw and red, and there was a bruise on her jaw that had faded to yellow-green. "You're going to die sitting there," Caleb said. She looked up then. Her eyes were gray, the color of the winter sky before snow. "That's supposed to scare me? It's supposed to be a fact. I've heard worse facts." She turned her gaze back to the street, dismissing him. Move along. Caleb should have. Should have walked right back across to Morrison's, collected his supplies, and ridden back up the mountain where other people's poor decisions couldn't complicate his life. Instead, he heard himself say, "When's the last time you ate?" "What's it to you?" "Nothing. But if you're determined to die, seems like you'd pick something quicker than starvation." That got a reaction, a flicker of something that might have been humor in those gray eyes. "You always this charming?" "I'm not charming. I'm practical." He studied her for a moment, trying to figure out what the hell he was doing. "You got skills?" "Excuse me? Can you cook? Clean? Do you know how to work?" Her jaw tightened. "I'm not a whore." "Didn't ask if you were. Asked if you can work." "Why?" "Good question." Caleb didn't have a good answer. He had a bad answer, which was that something about the set of her shoulders reminded him of someone he used to know, someone who'd been too stubborn to bend even when bending would have saved her. That was a stupid reason to do anything, and he knew it. "I need help," he said, which was a lie. "Up at my place, as someone to keep house through the winter. It's hard work, the cabin's small, and I don't talk much, but you'll have food and shelter. You'll live." She stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. "Why would you offer that?" "Because I'm an idiot, apparently." He shifted his weight, suddenly aware that people were watching from windows, and that this conversation was going to be all over town by nightfall. "You want the offer or not?" "I don't know you." "Name's Caleb Rourke. I live alone about 12 miles up the North Ridge. I come down twice a year for supplies. I don't drink, I don't hit, and I don't expect anything from you except work. You can leave when the snow melts if you want, or before, if you're willing to risk the walk down. That's all you need to know." She looked at him for a long time, those gray eyes taking him apart piece by piece. Caleb had been looked at plenty of ways in his life, with fear, with hate, with the kind of empty politeness that was worse than either. But this was different. She was measuring him, calculating odds. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lydia Vale." "Well, Lydia Vale, what's it going to be?" She stood up slowly, unfolding from the steps like her bones hurt. She was shorter than he'd thought, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder, but she stood straight, looked him dead in the eye. "If you try anything," she said quietly, "I'll kill you in your sleep." "Fair enough. I mean it. I believe you." And he did. There was something in her eyes that said she'd done harder things than kill a man who deserved it. "Get your things." "This is my things." She gestured to herself, the thin dress, the worn boots, nothing else. Christ. Caleb jerked his head toward Morrison's. "Come on, you'll need a coat at minimum, unless you want to freeze before we get there." Morrison looked up when they came in together, his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. Caleb ignored him, steered Lydia toward the dry goods section. "Pick a coat," he said. "Wool. Heaviest one that fits." She touched a brown wool coat like she wasn't sure it was real. "I can't pay for this." "I didn't ask you to." Caleb turned to Morrison. "Add it to my account and get her some gloves, decent ones, and a scarf." "Caleb," Morrison said carefully, "you sure you know what you're doing?" "No." Caleb met his eyes. "But I'm doing it anyway. You got a problem with that?" Morrison held up his hands. "Your life just seems sudden, is all. Everything's sudden if you're not expecting it." Caleb turned back to Lydia, who was still standing there with her hand on the coat like she couldn't quite make herself take it. "Put it on. You're no good to me with frostbite. She did, her fingers clumsy with cold as she worked the buttons. The coat was too big in the shoulders, but it would keep her alive. Morrison brought over gloves and a thick scarf without another word, adding them to the pile of supplies he'd already assembled. That everything? Morrison asked. Caleb scanned the counter. Add another 10 pounds of beans and double the coffee. That's a lot of coffee for one person. There's 2 of us now. The words felt strange in his mouth. How long since he'd said something like that? 14 years? 15? Just add it. While Morrison tallied everything up, Caleb felt Lydia's eyes on him. He didn't look at her. If he looked at her, he might see doubt or worse, hope. And if he saw hope, he might remember all the reasons this was a terrible idea and change his mind. Comes to $42.18, Morrison said. Caleb pulled out his coin purse, counted out the money. Morrison took it slowly, like he was giving Caleb one last chance to reconsider. When Caleb didn't, he sighed and made change. Supplies will be ready in about 20 minutes, Morrison said. Want me to bring them out? I'll get them. Caleb turned to Lydia. Wait here, don't wander off. Where would I go? He almost smiled at that. Almost. Outside, the temperature had dropped another few degrees. The sun was higher now, but gave no warmth, just glare off the snow. Caleb loaded the supplies into Stubbs' saddlebags, working through the familiar routine while his mind tried to catch up with what he'd just done. He'd offered shelter to a stranger, brought her into his life, his space, his carefully maintained isolation. Why? Because she looked proud? Because she reminded him of someone? Those weren't reasons, those were impulses, and Caleb Rourke didn't do impulses, hadn't in years. But it was done now. And Caleb was a lot of things, but he wasn't a man who went back on his word. When he came back inside, Lydia was standing exactly where he'd left her, her new coat buttoned up to her chin. She looked warmer already, or maybe that was just wishful thinking. You ride? Caleb asked. No. Then you'll walk. Can you manage 12 miles? I'll manage. It's uphill. Snow's deep in places. I said I'll manage. Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, let's go. They left Copper Hollow in silence, Caleb on Stubb and Lydia walking beside them. People watched from windows and doorways, and Caleb could feel their stares like heat on his back. Let them look. Let them talk. He'd be gone in an hour and wouldn't be back for months. What they thought didn't matter. The trail climbed steadily from the valley floor, winding through stands of pine that cut the wind but made the shadows deeper and colder. Stubb knew the way without guidance, which freed Caleb to watch Lydia from the corner of his eye. She walked with her head up, her breathing steady despite the altitude and the cold. She didn't complain, didn't ask how much further, just kept putting one foot in front of the other, like walking through snow at high altitude in boots that probably pinched was the most natural thing in the world. After about 2 hours, Caleb stopped and dismounted. Rest, he said. I'm fine. You're breathing hard and you're limping. Rest. She looked like she wanted to argue, but after a moment she leaned against a tree, taking the weight off her feet. Caleb pulled out his canteen, took a drink, then offered it to her. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his as she did. How much further? She asked. 4, maybe 5 hours depending on the snow. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, there was determination there, hard as stone. Okay. You don't have to do this, Caleb said. Wasn't sure why he was giving her an out, but it felt necessary. I can take you back. No shame in it. There's shame in everything, Lydia said quietly. Might as well be warm while I feel it. They kept walking. The sun was well past its peak when the cabin finally came into view. It sat in a small clearing carved out of the pines, backed up against a granite outcrop that broke the worst of the north wind. Smoke rose from the chimney. Caleb always banked the fire before he left, and it usually held. And the windows were dark but intact. It wasn't much. Single room, maybe 20 feet by 20, with a loft for sleeping and storage. But the walls were solid, the roof didn't leak, and the stove could heat the whole space when it needed to. Caleb had built it himself 14 years ago when he'd first come up here looking for a place the world couldn't reach. Lydia stopped at the edge of the clearing, looking at the cabin like she was trying to decide if it was real. This is it, Caleb said. Not much to look at, but it's solid. Keeps the cold out, keeps the heat in. That's all that matters up here. She didn't respond, just kept staring. Caleb dismounted, started unloading the supplies. Barn's around back, well's there too, though it's probably frozen over by now. We'll have to melt snow for water until it thaws. Still nothing. Lydia. She blinked, turned to look at him. What? You all right? I don't know. Her voice was flat, exhausted. Ask me tomorrow. Fair enough? He jerked his head toward the cabin. Go inside, get warm. I'll be in once I've taken care of Stubb. She walked to the door, hesitated with her hand on the latch. Caleb. Yeah? Why did you do this? Caleb looked at her across the snow, this woman he didn't know, whose presence had already changed something fundamental about the life he'd built. He could have lied, could have given her the easy answer about needing help, about practical considerations and winter hardship. Instead, he told the truth. I don't know. She nodded like that made perfect sense and went inside. Caleb stood there in the cold for a moment longer, watching the smoke rise from his chimney before leading Stubb toward the barn. The gelding huffed and shook his head, impatient for grain and rest, and Caleb reached up to scratch between his ears. Yeah, he muttered. I know. I'm an idiot. Stubb snorted in agreement. The inside of the cabin was exactly as Caleb had left it, clean, sparse, arranged for efficiency rather than comfort. One wall was dominated by the stone fireplace, another by the stove and a rough counter for food preparation. A table with 2 chairs. When had he gotten 2 chairs? He'd only needed one, sat near the window. The loft ladder climbed up to the sleeping area, and various shelves and hooks held the accumulated necessities of mountain living. Lydia stood in the middle of it all, slowly turning to take it in. Outhouse is about 30 yards that way, Caleb said, pointing. I'll show you in the morning when there's light. Chamber pot's under the bed if you need it before then. She nodded, still looking around. Loft's where I sleep. You'll take the cot down here. He gestured to a low bed frame in the corner, currently covered with furs and a wool blanket. It's not soft, but it's dry, and the stove's close enough to keep you warm. Where will you sleep? I just said, the loft. But... She stopped, seemed to reconsider whatever she'd been about to say. All right. Caleb started unloading supplies from the bags he'd carried in, finding homes for everything with the automatic precision of long habit. Flour in the bin, sugar in the jar, coffee in the tin, salt, beans, dried fruit, powder and shot in the locked box, everything in its place. Lydia watched for a moment, then started to help, following his lead without asking where things went. She had good instincts, put the coffee near the stove where it would stay dry, stacked the cans in order of size. Small things, but they suggested someone who'd worked before, who understood how a space should function. When the supplies were put away, Caleb moved to the stove and started building up the fire. The cabin had held some heat, but it was still cold enough to see their breath. He added wood, adjusted the draft, and within minutes the fire was crackling properly. You hungry? He asked. Yes. The word came out small, almost ashamed. Caleb pulled out a cast iron pan, started cutting salt pork into strips. I'm not fancy. Food's food up here. It keeps you alive, that's all that matters. I'm not complaining. Didn't say you were. He set the pork to frying, pulled out a tin of beans. There's bread in the box there if you want it. It's a week old, but it'll soften in your mouth. She found the bread, broke off a piece, ate it slowly like she was savoring every bite. Or like she was too hungry to trust herself to eat faster. They ate in silence, Caleb at the table and Lydia on the cot, both of them too focused on the food to bother with conversation. When Lydia finished, she set her plate aside and looked at him. What do you want me to do? She asked. Tonight? Nothing. Rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out what needs doing. I should do something. You fed me, gave me shelter, and you walked 12 miles in the snow without complaining. That's enough for one day. Caleb stood, collected the plates. You know how to shoot? The question seemed to catch her off guard. What? A gun. Do you know how to use one? No. I'll teach you. Not tonight, but soon. You're going to need to know living up here. Why? Bears, mostly. Wolves sometimes. And He trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence. And in case I die and you need to survive alone, and in case someone comes up here looking for trouble, and because everyone should know how to defend themselves, and because it's a good skill to have, he finished lamely. Lydia nodded slowly. Okay. The fire popped and settled. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the shutters. It was going to be a cold night, and this was just the start. November would be worse. December worse still. By January, they'd be snowed in completely, and by February, they'd be sick of the sight of each other. If they made it that long. I'm going to bed, Caleb said. Bank the fire before you sleep, but leave a couple logs on. It'll die down overnight, but it shouldn't go out completely. You'll freeze if it does. I know how to tend a fire. Good. He climbed the ladder to the loft, his body aching from the long day. At the top, he paused and looked down at her, this stranger in his space. She was sitting on the cot, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the fire. Lydia. She looked up. The door locks from the inside, he said. Bar it if it makes you feel safer. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or relief. Thank you. Just don't bar me out if the cabin catches fire. That almost got a smile. Almost. Caleb rolled into his bed, a pile of furs and blankets that he'd accumulated over the years, and lay there staring at the ceiling. Below, he could hear Lydia moving around, the soft sounds of someone settling in. The fire crackled. The wind howled. He'd really done it. Brought another person into his life, into his space, into the carefully controlled isolation he'd built for himself. For the first time in 14 years, he wasn't alone. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, lying there in the dark with the sounds of another person breathing below, Caleb felt something else entirely. He felt awake. The first week passed in a careful dance of two people learning to exist in the same small space. Caleb woke at dawn by habit, climbing down from the loft to find Lydia already awake, sitting on her cot and watching the gray light creep through the windows. He showed her the outhouse that first morning, a quick trip through knee-deep snow that left them both gasping from the cold. After that, he laid out the daily routine: morning fire, coffee, breakfast. Then the work. And there was always work. Wood to chop and stack, snow to melt for water, the barn to muck out, though with just stub it wasn't much. Traps to check along the line Caleb had set before he'd gone to town. Food to prepare, clothing to mend. 100 small tasks that kept a person alive when the nearest help was miles away, and the temperature could kill you in minutes if you weren't careful. Lydia threw herself into it all with a ferocious energy that surprised him. She didn't know how to do most of it, had clearly never chopped wood or skinned a rabbit or rendered fat, but she learned fast and didn't complain about the parts that were ugly or hard. When he showed her how to gut a fish, she just nodded and did it, her hands steady even when they were covered in blood and slime. You're tougher than you look, Caleb said on the third day, watching her work through a pile of firewood with the hatchet, her breath coming in sharp white bursts. I've had practice. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. They fell into a pattern. Caleb handled the heavy work, the hunting, the wood chopping, the repairs to the barn roof where a branch had punched through during a storm. Lydia took over the cooking and the cleaning, turning the cabin from a place where Caleb survived into something that almost felt like a home. She had a way with food that he hadn't expected. Even with limited supplies, she made things taste better than they had any right to. She didn't just throw salt pork and beans in a pan. She cooked them slow, added wild onions she found growing near the well, used the bacon fat to make the beans rich and filling. She baked bread that actually rose instead of sitting in your stomach like a rock. Where'd you learn to cook? Caleb asked one night, mopping up the last of his stew with a piece of bread. My mother. Lydia was washing dishes, her back to him. Before she died. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was a long time ago. But the set of her shoulders said it wasn't that long at all. The conversations were like that, brief, careful, each of them rationing out information like it was as precious as the coffee or the lamp oil. Caleb learned that Lydia had come west on the stage, running from something she wouldn't name, that she'd expected to meet someone in Copper Hollow who hadn't been there, that she'd been stranded with no money and no prospects and too much pride to beg. She learned that Caleb had built the cabin himself, that he'd been a trapper and a prospector before settling into this hermit life. that he preferred his own company to other people's, that he'd been alone up here for 14 years and had liked it just fine. Neither of them mentioned why they'd ended up here, in this particular configuration of loneliness and circumstance. That felt like dangerous territory, and they were both too smart to wander into it. But at night, lying in the dark and listening to her breathe below, Caleb felt the weight of unasked questions pressing down. Who had she been running from? What had put that bruise on her jaw? Why had she looked at him that first day like dying was preferable to accepting kindness? And the question he didn't want to examine too closely, why did it matter to him? On the 8th day, Caleb took her out to teach her to shoot. The morning was clear and brutally cold, the kind of cold that made your teeth ache and your eyes water. They walked about 100 yards from the cabin to a small clearing where Caleb had set up targets in the past, stumps and branches arranged against a snowbank. He handed her his spare rifle, an older model he kept for emergencies. "You know the parts." "No?" So he showed her stock, barrel, trigger, sight, how to load it, how to hold it, how to brace for the kick. She listened with the same fierce concentration she brought to everything, her gray eyes focused on his hands as he demonstrated. "Most important thing," Caleb said, "is respect. This isn't a toy. It's a tool, and it can kill you or someone else if you're careless. You never point it at anything you don't intend to shoot. You always assume it's loaded, and you never, ever put your finger on the trigger until you're ready to fire. Understand?" "Yes?" "Say it back to me. Never point it at anything I don't want to shoot. Always assume it's loaded. Finger off the trigger until I'm ready." She met his eyes. "Respect the tool because it can kill." "Good." He stepped behind her, adjusted her stance. Feet shoulder-width apart. Lean into it a little or the kick will knock you on your ass. Bring it up to your shoulder, settle the stock against you. Tight, but not so tight you're shaking. She did, her movements uncertain but precise. Caleb reached around to adjust her grip, and for a moment he was acutely aware of how close they were standing, how small she felt next to him, how he could smell whatever soap she'd used when she'd washed that morning. Something clean and simple. He stepped back quickly. "Now sight down the barrel. See that mark on the stump? That's your target." Lydia squinted down the sight, her breath coming in short clouds. "I see it. When you're ready, exhale slowly and squeeze. Don't pull the trigger. Let the shot surprise you." She stood there for a long moment, perfectly still. Then she exhaled, squeezed, and the rifle cracked loud in the cold air. The kick drove her back a step, but she kept her feet. The bullet went wide, kicking up snow about 3 feet left of the target. "Again," Caleb said. She reloaded, fumbling a bit but getting it done, and fired again. Closer this time, but still wide. "You're pulling left." Anticipating the kick. "Don't fight it, just let it happen." Third shot hit the stump low and right. Fourth shot was closer. By the 10th shot, she was hitting the target more often than not, and by the 20th, she was grouping them tight enough that Caleb felt something like pride. "You're a natural," he said. "Or you're a good teacher." "I'm not. You're just stubborn enough to make it work." He took the rifle from her, saw her hands were shaking. "Cold?" "A little." "We'll head back. That's enough for today." But as they walked back to the cabin, Lydia said, "Can we do this again tomorrow?" "You want to?" "I want to be able to defend myself." She looked at him, her expression serious. "You said that's why you were teaching me. So I can." "Yeah," Caleb said. "We can do it again tomorrow." And they did. And the day after that. Within 2 weeks, Lydia could hit a target at 50 yards with reasonable consistency, could load and fire without thinking about the steps, could strip and clean the rifle blindfolded if she had to. Caleb watched her shoot one morning, watched the way she'd learned to breathe through the recoil and adjust for wind and distance, and thought, she's not running anymore, she's preparing. For what? He didn't ask. But he felt the shift in her like a change in the weather, and it made something in his chest tighten. November deepened, the snow got heavier, the temperatures dropped, and the world shrank down to just the cabin, the barn, and the trapline. They fell into an easy rhythm, their movements synchronized by necessity and proximity. Caleb could predict when Lydia would need more water before she asked. Lydia knew when to have coffee ready before Caleb realized he wanted it. They talked more, small conversations that happened while they worked. Lydia told him about growing up in Ohio, about a father who drank and a mother who died young. about a sister she'd lost track of somewhere in Kansas. Caleb told her about the war, not the bad parts, but the parts that made sense, the parts about men he'd served with and battles that had meant something at the time. Neither of them talked about the years in between, the gap between who they'd been and who they were now. That territory was still too dangerous. But one night, after they'd eaten and Lydia was darning one of Caleb's shirts while he worked on a new handle for the axe, she said quietly, "Why did you come up here?" Caleb's hand stilled. "What?" 14 years ago, you came up here and built this cabin and stayed. Why?" He could have deflected, could have given her some line about wanting peace and quiet, about liking the mountains, about seeking a simpler life. But they'd been living in each other's pockets for over a month now, and lies didn't seem to work anymore. "I lost someone," he said. "My wife. And after she died, I couldn't—" He trailed off, trying to find words for something he'd never spoken aloud. "I couldn't be around people anymore. Couldn't stand the way they looked at me, the things they said. So I left." Lydia's needles stilled. "How did she die?" "Cholera. There was an outbreak in the mining camp where we were living. She got sick fast. Was gone in 3 days. The memory was old enough that it didn't cut anymore, but it still left a dull ache. I buried her there and walked until I found this place. Haven't left since. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it hurt less." Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw understanding in those gray eyes. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling fire and the wind outside. Then Lydia said, "I was married too, for about 6 months." Caleb waited, not pushing. "He wasn't a good man." Her voice was flat, factual. "I thought he was, when I married him. Thought I was lucky. But he—" She stopped, her hands clenching on the shirt. "It doesn't matter. He's dead now." "Did you kill him?" She looked up sharply. "Would it matter if I had?" "No." She studied him for a long moment, then shook her head. "No, he died in a bar fight 3 months after we married. But I would have, if I'd been brave enough. Takes more bravery to leave." "I didn't leave. I was stranded. There's a difference." "You didn't go back?" "No." Her voice was soft but hard as stone. "I didn't go back." Caleb set down the axe handle, leaned forward. "The man I saw in town, the day I found you, the one who gave you that bruise, was he my husband's brother?" Lydia's jaw tightened. "He thought he'd inherited me along with the rest of the property. I disagreed." "That why you ran?" "That's why I fought. Running came after." She went back to her darning, her stitches sharp and precise. "I got on the stage in Denver thinking someone would be waiting for me. A cousin I'd written to, someone who'd said I could stay with her, but when I got there she was gone. Moved on, the neighbors said. No forwarding address. So you were stuck." "So I was stuck." She tied off a knot, snipped the thread. "And then this stubborn mountain man offered me a way out, and I was too tired to say no." "You're not tired now." She looked at him, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "No," she said. "I'm not tired now." The fire popped, the wind rattled the shutters, and Caleb felt the space between them shift in a way he couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore either. He stood abruptly. "I'm going to check the barn." "It's freezing out." "Stub needs fresh hay." "You put hay out this morning." "Then I'll check it anyway." He was already pulling on his coat, needing the cold and the distance and the space to think. "Bank the fire before bed." "Caleb—" But he was already out the door, letting the brutal cold hit him like a fist. The barn was dark and smelled like hay and horse, and the particular cold that settled into wood when winter really dug in. Caleb stood there breathing hard, his breath coming in white clouds, and tried to figure out what the hell had just happened. Nothing had happened. That was the problem. They'd just been talking, sharing pieces of their past like people did when they lived together, when proximity wore down the walls you'd built. It was natural, normal, except it hadn't felt normal. It had felt like standing on the edge of something steep and knowing that one wrong step would send you tumbling. Stubb nickered from his stall, probably wondering why his owner was standing in the freezing barn at night like an idiot. "Yeah, I know," Caleb muttered. He grabbed a brush and let himself into the stall, started working over Stubb's coat with long, methodical strokes. The gelding leaned into it, content to stand there and accept the attention he didn't need. The problem was that Caleb had started to notice things. The way Lydia hummed sometimes when she thought he wasn't listening. The way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating on something difficult. How she'd stopped flinching when he moved too fast or spoke too loud. How she'd started to relax into this space they shared. How she'd started to feel like she belonged here. That was dangerous thinking. She was here for the winter, that was all. Come spring, she'd leave, back to town, back to whatever life she'd build for herself now that she wasn't running anymore. That was the deal. Shelter for work, and when the snow melted, they'd both go back to being alone. Except Caleb didn't want to be alone anymore. The realization hit him like a physical blow. 14 years he'd spent up here, convincing himself that solitude was what he needed, that people were the problem and isolation was the cure. 14 years of quiet and routine and carefully controlled emptiness. And now, after 6 weeks with another person in his space, he couldn't remember why he'd thought that was enough. "Christ," he said aloud. Stubb's ear flicked back, but the horse didn't comment. Caleb finished brushing him down, checked his water and hay, even though both were fine, and stood there in the cold trying to find a reason to stay out here longer. When he couldn't, he headed back to the cabin, steeling himself for what? Lydia asking questions he didn't want to answer, the weight of that conversation hanging between them. But when he came inside, she was already in her cot, turned toward the wall, her breathing deep and even. Asleep, or pretending to be. Either way, she was giving him an out. Caleb banked the fire, climbed up to the loft, and lay there staring at the darkness while the wind howled outside and his mind refused to settle. Below, Lydia shifted in her sleep, and Caleb closed his eyes and tried not to think about how right it felt to have her there. The next morning came too early and too cold. When Caleb climbed down from the loft, Lydia was already up, the fire going strong and coffee brewing on the stove. She didn't look at him when he came down, just poured him a cup and set it on the table. "Thanks," he said. "There's oatmeal. Not much, but it's hot." They ate in silence, the air between them thick with things neither of them wanted to say. Finally, Lydia set down her spoon and looked at him. "I'm sorry about last night." "You didn't do anything wrong." "I pushed, asked things I shouldn't have." "You asked a question. I answered it." Caleb wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, needing the warmth. "We're living together. Makes sense to know something about each other." "Does it?" She met his eyes. "Because you've done fine up here alone for 14 years. You don't need to know anything about me to survive the winter." "Maybe not." He took a drink of coffee, buying time. "But it helps." "Helps what?" "Helps it feel less like I'm housing a stranger and more like—" He stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence without saying too much. "More like what?" Caleb looked at her across the table, this woman who'd been a stranger 6 weeks ago and now felt like something else entirely. Something that didn't have a name yet, but was growing teeth anyway. "Like we're both just trying to get through," he said finally. Lydia's expression softened slightly. "Yeah, okay." They finished breakfast without talking, cleaned up in tandem like they'd been doing it for years instead of weeks. When everything was put away, Caleb pulled on his coat. "I'm going to check the trap line. Might be gone a few hours." "Want company?" He almost said yes. Almost asked her to come with him, to walk the line together, to fill the silence with conversation, or just the presence of another person. But the need for space was still there, pressing on him, and he shook his head. "It's a long walk in deep snow. Save your energy for firewood." If she was disappointed, she didn't show it, just nodded and turned back to the stove. "Be careful." "Always am." The trap line ran in a wide loop through the forest, following game trails and crossing frozen streams, each trap carefully placed where Caleb knew animals would pass. He checked them methodically, resetting the ones that had been triggered by wind or snow, collecting the 2 rabbits and 1 pine marten he'd caught. The work was familiar, almost meditative, and it gave him time to think. The problem was, he didn't want to think, because thinking meant examining the way his chest tightened when Lydia smiled, or the way he'd started listening for her footsteps in the morning, or how the cabin felt empty now when she wasn't in it. Thinking meant admitting that somewhere in the last 6 weeks, something had shifted, and he wasn't sure he could shift it back. He told himself she was just help. A practical solution to a practical problem. Someone to share the work so he didn't break his back trying to do everything alone. That had been true at the start. It wasn't true anymore. By the time he got back to the cabin, the sun was past its peak and his hands were numb despite his gloves. Lydia met him at the door, took the game from him without a word, and set about preparing it for the pot while he thawed out by the fire. "Good haul," she said, working the marten's pelt free with quick, practiced movements. When had she gotten good at that? He'd shown her once, maybe twice, and now she moved like she'd been doing it all her life. "Not bad. Should have enough for a decent stew. I was thinking we could trade the pelts next time you go to town. Get some things we're running low on. Next time won't be until spring." Caleb peeled off his gloves, flexed his fingers to get the blood moving again. "Passes will be closed solid by next week." Lydia paused in her work. "So we're stuck here, just the two of us, until April. Maybe May, depending on the snow." He watched her face, trying to read what she was thinking. "That a problem? Should it be? You tell me." She went back to skinning the marten, her knife moving with precision. "I've been in worse situations." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." She glanced at him, something unreadable in those gray eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, Caleb. Not for months. So we might as well make it work." "We have been making it work." "Have we?" She set down the knife, turned to face him fully. "Because last night you ran out of here like the cabin was on fire, and this morning you could barely look at me. That doesn't feel like it's working." Caleb opened his mouth, closed it. She was right, and they both knew it. "I'm not good at this," he said finally. "At what?" "People. Being around them. Talking to them." He gestured vaguely. "Any of it." "You've been doing fine for 6 weeks." That's different." "How?" "Because it was easy when she was just help, when she was just someone passing through, when he could keep her at arm's length and pretend she didn't matter. But now she did matter, and that changed everything." "It just is," he said, knowing how weak that sounded. Lydia studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, then let me make this simple. I'm not asking you to be good at people. I'm asking you to stop running every time we get close to something real. Can you do that?" "I don't know." "Try." The word hung between them, a challenge and a plea. Caleb looked at her standing there with blood on her hands and determination on her face, and felt something in his chest crack open. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I can try." December came in hard. The snow fell for 3 days straight, burying the cabin up to the windowsills and sealing them in completely. They burned through firewood faster than Caleb liked, but there was nothing to be done about it. When the storm finally broke, they dug themselves out and found a world transformed, everything white and silent and impossibly deep. "We're going to need more wood," Lydia said, standing in the doorway and looking at the snow. "I know." Caleb was already calculating how much they had left, how much they'd need to make it to spring. "I'll start cutting tomorrow." "I'll help." You don't need to." "Caleb." She turned to look at him. "We're in this together now. Stop trying to do everything yourself." So they cut wood together, working in tandem through the short winter days. Caleb felled the trees, dead pines that had been marked by lightning or disease, and Lydia helped him buck them into lengths and split them. It was brutal work, made worse by the cold and the altitude, but they developed a rhythm. Caleb would swing the axe and Lydia would stack. Then they'd trade off when his arms got tired or her back started to ache. They talked while they worked, small conversations about nothing important. Lydia told him about a dog she'd had as a child, a mutt named Rusty who'd followed her everywhere. Caleb told her about learning to trap from an old Shoshone man who taught him to read the land like a book. They swapped stories about bad winters and good hunts, and the kinds of small miracles that kept people alive when everything else was trying to kill them. And slowly, carefully, they stopped being strangers. One night, after they'd both collapsed by the fire, too exhausted to even think about cooking, Lydia said, "Tell me about her." Caleb didn't need to ask who she meant. "What do you want to know?" "Anything. Everything." Lydia was sitting on the floor with her back against her cot, her legs stretched out toward the fire. You said her name was… What was her name? Sarah. The name felt strange in his mouth after so many years. Sarah Jane Rourke. How'd you meet? Her father owned the general store in the mining camp where I was working. I'd come in for supplies and she'd be there behind the counter, giving me hell for tracking mud on her clean floor. The memory made him almost smile. She was fierce, didn't take anything from anybody. Sounds like someone I know, Lydia said quietly. Caleb glanced at her. Yeah, maybe. Did you love her? More than I knew how to say. He leaned back in his chair, let the memories come. We got married in the spring. Her father wasn't happy about it. I was just a miner, no prospects, no money. But Sarah didn't care. Said she'd rather be poor with someone she loved than rich with someone she didn't. Smart woman. Stubborn woman. He shook his head. We had plans. We're going to save enough to buy a piece of land, build a house, maybe have kids. All the normal things people want. What happened? Cholera outbreak in the summer. Hit the camp hard. Sarah got it early, before we even knew what it was. His throat tightened. She was sick on a Monday, dead by Wednesday. I buried her on the hillside above the camp, and by Friday I'd packed everything I owned and left. Just like that? Just like that. He met her eyes. Couldn't stay there. Couldn't stand looking at the place we'd built our plans, knowing none of it mattered anymore. So I walked until I found this spot, and I stayed. Lydia was quiet for a long time. Then she said, You think she'd want that? You being alone up here? Doesn't matter what she'd want, she's dead. It matters to you. Caleb stood abruptly, needing to move. What do you want me to say, Lydia? That I wasted 14 years hiding from the world because I was too much of a coward to face it? That I built this whole life around not feeling anything because feeling hurt too damn much? You want me to admit that? I want you to stop punishing yourself for surviving. The words hit like a slap. Caleb stared at her, and Lydia stood to face him, her expression fierce. You think I don't know what that looks like? She said. I spent 6 months married to a man who hurt me, then 3 more running from his brother who thought he could do the same. And you know what I learned? Guilt doesn't bring back the dead, and it doesn't make the living any stronger. It just eats you from the inside until there's nothing left. This is different. It's not different. You lost someone you loved. It broke you. But you're still here, Caleb, and at some point you have to decide if that means something or if you're just waiting to die. Maybe I am. Bullshit. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her gray eyes. If you were waiting to die, you wouldn't have brought me here. You wouldn't have taught me to shoot or shown me how to survive or any of it. You brought me here because part of you still wants to live, even if you're too scared to admit it. I'm not scared. Then prove it. Her voice dropped, went quiet and intense. Stop hiding. Stop running. Just be here. With me. For however long we've got. Caleb's heart was pounding. They were standing so close he could feel the heat radiating off her, could see the pulse jumping in her throat. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to step back, to put distance between them, to retreat to the safety of isolation. But he'd promised to try. So instead of stepping back, he reached out and touched her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. She went very still, her eyes locked on his. I don't know how to do this, he said. Neither do I. We'll probably mess it up. Probably. The smart thing would be to keep our distance, keep this professional. When have either of us ever done the smart thing? Fair point. Caleb felt a laugh bubble up, unexpected and rusty from disuse. Lydia smiled then, really smiled, and something in his chest unlocked. Okay, he said. Okay. He kissed her then, or she kissed him. Later, he wouldn't be able to say who moved first, but suddenly her hands were in his hair and his arms were around her waist, and they were kissing like drowning people who'd just found air. It was messy and desperate, and nothing like the careful distance they'd maintained for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lydia rested her forehead against his chest. Well, she said, that happened. Yeah, Caleb's voice came out rough. It did. Now what? Good question. Caleb looked down at her, this woman who'd somehow worked her way past every defense he'd built, and decided he was done pretending he didn't care. "Now we figure it out as we go," he said. They didn't sleep together that night. Caleb climbed to the loft and Lydia stayed on her cot, both of them needing time to adjust to this new thing between them. But when morning came and Caleb climbed down to find Lydia already making coffee, she smiled at him in a way she hadn't before. Open, unguarded, warm. "Morning," she said. "Morning." They moved around each other differently now, the careful distance replaced with casual touches. Her hand on his shoulder as she passed, his fingers brushing hers when he handed her a cup. Small things, but they added up to something bigger. The days settled into a new rhythm. They still worked together, still fell into the familiar patterns of survival. But there was an ease now that hadn't existed before. They talked more, argued sometimes about stupid things like the best way to render fat or whether the weather would break before Christmas. They laughed, actual, genuine laughter that filled the cabin and made it feel less like a shelter and more like a home. And at night, after the fire was banked and the day's work was done, they'd sit together on the floor in front of the stove, shoulders touching, and talk about everything and nothing until exhaustion pulled them to their separate beds. It wasn't perfect. They still had moments where Caleb would retreat into himself, where old habits would kick in and he'd pull away without meaning to. And Lydia had her own ghosts, nightmares that would wake her gasping, moments where a sudden movement would make her flinch before she could stop herself. But they were learning each other's rhythms, each other's wounds, the shapes of the spaces they each needed. Learning that healing wasn't linear and trust wasn't automatic, and sometimes the bravest thing you could do was just stay. Christmas came and went without fanfare. They had no decorations, no gifts, no way to mark the day except by acknowledging it. But Lydia made a special dinner, rabbit stew thick with wild onions and potatoes she'd hoarded from the fall, bread that actually rose properly, dried apples stewed with cinnamon. "This is good," Caleb said. "Really good." "It's what we have." But she looked pleased. "My mother used to make something like this. Not as good, but close." They ate in comfortable silence, the firelight casting warm shadows across the cabin walls. When they finished, Caleb pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth and set it on the table. "What's this?" Lydia asked. "Open it." She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a pair of gloves, sturdy leather lined with rabbit fur, stitched together with care. Caleb had been working on them for weeks, late at night when she was asleep, using scraps of leather he'd saved and fur from the rabbits they'd trapped. "You made these?" Her voice was soft. "Figured you needed better ones. Those you've got are falling apart." She slipped them on, flexed her fingers. They fit perfectly. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's not much. It's everything." She stood, came around the table, and kissed him hard. "Thank you." They stood there holding each other while the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, and Caleb thought, This is what I've been missing." That night, when the fire burned low and the cold crept in despite their best efforts, Lydia climbed the ladder to the loft. Caleb sat up. "What are you doing?" "It's freezing down there, and you're warm." She looked at him, her expression uncertain for the first time in weeks. "Is this okay?" Was it okay? They'd been dancing around this for weeks now, careful not to push too fast, both of them aware that once they crossed this line, there'd be no going back. But looking at her standing there in her nightdress with his gloves still on her hands, Caleb couldn't think of a single reason to say no. "Yeah," he said. "It's okay." She settled in beside him, and he pulled the furs over both of them. For a while they just lay there, getting used to the feel of another body in the bed, the shared warmth, the simple comfort of not being alone. "Caleb?" Her voice was quiet in the darkness. "Yeah? I'm glad you found me that day." He pulled her closer, felt her settle against his chest. "Me too." Outside, the wind screamed and the snow fell and the temperature dropped to brutal lows. But inside, wrapped in furs and each other's warmth, they slept better than either of them had in years. January brought the deepest cold, the kind that made metal burn bare skin and turned breath to ice crystals before it left your mouth. They stayed inside as much as possible, venturing out only for the necessary tasks: firewood, checking on Stubb, clearing snow from the roof before the weight became dangerous. The cabin became their whole world. They learned every inch of it, every creaky board and drafty corner. They learned each other too, in ways both physical and not. Caleb discovered that Lydia sang when she thought he wasn't listening, old songs her mother had taught her. Lydia learned that Caleb talked in his sleep sometimes, fragments of conversations with ghosts. They made love for the first time during a 3-day storm that buried the cabin to the eaves. Not because it was romantic or planned, but because they were there and alive and the world outside was trying to kill them, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world to reach for each other. Afterward, lying tangled in furs with Lydia's head on his chest, Caleb said, "I haven't done this in a long time." "Was it terrible?" She sounded amused. "No, just different than I remembered." "Different how?" He thought about it, trying to find words. "With Sarah, it felt like we were building something, a future. This feels like we're building now," Lydia finished. "Not planning for someday, just now." "Yeah." She propped herself up on one elbow, looked down at him. "Is that enough?" "I don't know." Honest answer. "But it's all I've got to give." "Then it'll have to be enough." She kissed him softly. "For both of us." They spent those storm-bound days learning the shapes of each other's bodies, the sounds each of them made, what worked and what didn't. It was fumbling sometimes, awkward in the way of two people who'd been alone too long. But it was real, and it was theirs, and that counted for something. When the storm finally broke and they could venture outside again, Caleb stood in the doorway looking at the pristine white landscape and felt something shift in his understanding of the world. For 14 years, this place had been a refuge from pain, a place to hide from a life that had broken him. But standing there with Lydia beside him, her hand warm in his, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like home. February tested them in ways the cold never could. The snow kept falling, week after week, until the world outside the cabin became an abstract concept, something they knew existed but couldn't quite believe in. The trapline was buried too deep to check. The barn was a twice-daily expedition that required digging a trench through chest-high drifts. And the walls of the cabin, which had felt cozy in November, began to feel like they were closing in. Caleb noticed the change in Lydia first. Small things, the way she'd stand at the window for long stretches, staring out at the endless white. How she'd snap at him over nothing, then apologize immediately. The restless energy that had her pacing the small space like a caged animal. "You okay?" he asked one morning, watching her wear a path in the floorboards. "Fine." "You're not fine." She stopped, turned to face him. "I'm going crazy in here, Caleb. 4 months of the same 4 walls, the same routines, the same everything. I feel like I'm forgetting there's a world outside this cabin. There's not much of one right now, just snow and cold and more snow. That's not helping." He set down the harness he'd been mending. "What do you need?" "I don't know, space, air, something different." She laughed, but it had a brittle edge. "Which is stupid, because there's nowhere to go and nothing to do, and we're stuck here until spring." Caleb understood. He'd felt it himself in previous winters. That crushing sense of confinement, the way the isolation that had felt like freedom in the beginning could start to feel like a prison. But he'd always been alone before, able to work through it in his own way. With Lydia here, her restlessness fed his own, creating a feedback loop neither of them knew how to break. "Come here," he said. "What?" "Just come here." She crossed to him, wary. He pulled her down to sit beside him on the floor in front of the stove. "Close your eyes," he said. "Caleb, just do it. Trust me." She did, her expression skeptical. Caleb closed his own eyes and said, "Tell me what you hear." "What?" "Just listen. Tell me what you hear." Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then, "The fire. Wind outside. Your breathing." "What else?" "The stove ticking. Stub moving around in the barn. Snow sliding off the roof." "Good. Now smell. What do you smell?" "Smoke. Coffee. Leather." She paused. "You. Now touch." He took her hand, placed it on the floorboards. "What does this feel like?" "Wood. Smooth in some places, rough in others, warm near the stove." "Open your eyes." She did. Caleb was watching her, his expression serious. "This is what we've got," he said. "Right here, right now. Not what's outside or what's coming when spring hits. Just this moment. And yeah, it's small and it's repetitive and sometimes it feels like it'll never change. But it's real. And we're both alive in it. That counts for something." Lydia stared at him for a long moment. Then she kissed him hard, her hands fisting in his shirt. "I love you," she said against his mouth. "I know we haven't said it, and maybe it's too soon, and maybe I'm crazy, but I love you, and I needed you to know." Caleb's heart stopped, started again, harder. He pulled back enough to look at her, saw the fear and defiance mixed in those gray eyes. "You're not crazy," he said. "That's all you've got?" "I'm working on it." He touched her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I spent 14 years convincing myself I'd never feel this way about anyone again, that I didn't want to, and then you showed up and wrecked everything. Is that good or bad?" "I don't know yet." Honest answer. "But I know I don't want you to leave when spring comes. And I know that terrifies me more than anything in this mountain ever has." "That's not the same as saying you love me." "No, but it's what I've got right now. Is that enough?" Lydia studied his face, reading something there he wasn't sure he was ready to show. Then she nodded slowly. "For now," she said. "But Caleb? Someday I'm going to need more than just, 'I don't want you to leave.' I need to know if this is real for you or if I'm just convenient. You've never been convenient." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth. "You're difficult and stubborn, and you've complicated my life in every possible way, but you're not convenient." She laughed, and it sounded more real this time. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." "Then you've been around the wrong men." "Obviously. I'm here with you, aren't I?" They spent the rest of the day deliberately breaking their routine. Caleb taught her a card game he'd learned in the army, and they played for matches until Lydia had won them all. She taught him how to braid, useless knowledge up here, but it gave them something to do with their hands. They made love in the middle of the afternoon just because they could, then lay in the loft talking about nothing important until the light started to fade. It helped. Not completely. The cabin was still too small, and the winter was still too long, but it took the edge off. Reminded them both why they were doing this. But the tension came back 3 days later when Lydia woke from a nightmare screaming. Caleb jerked awake to find her sitting bolt upright, her whole body shaking, her breath coming in gasps that bordered on sobs. He reached for her carefully, not wanting to startle her further. "Lydia, you're safe. You're here with me." She flinched when he touched her, then seemed to recognize where she was, who he was. She collapsed against him, her face pressed to his chest. I'm sorry. "Don't be. It's okay." He held her while she shook, felt the rapid hammer of her heart. "Want to talk about it?" "No. Yes. I don't know." Her voice was muffled. "It was him. My husband's brother. He found us here, and he—" She broke off, shuddering. "He's not here. You're safe." I know it was just a dream, but it felt so real." Caleb tightened his arms around her. "Tell me about him. The brother." "Why?" "Because it's eating at you, and keeping it inside is making it worse." Lydia was quiet for so long, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, she started to talk. His name was Marcus. He'd been the one who'd introduced Lydia to her husband James, making him seem charming and successful when really he'd been neither. After James died, Marcus had shown up at the boarding house where Lydia was staying, told her she owed him for the money James had borrowed. When she couldn't pay, he'd suggested other arrangements. "He cornered me in my room," Lydia said, her voice flat and distant. "Told me I belonged to him now, that James's debts were mine. When I fought him off, he hit me, said next time he wouldn't be so gentle." Caleb felt rage building in his chest, hot and violent. "That's when you ran." "That's when I ran. Took what little money I had and bought a stage ticket as far as it would take me. Ended up in Copper Hollow because that's where the money ran out." She pulled back to look at him. "You asked me once if I'd killed my husband. I said no, but I would have killed Marcus if I'd had the chance." "Good." She blinked. "Good?" "Any man who puts his hands on a woman like that deserves what he gets." Caleb brushed hair back from her face. If he ever shows up here, he won't leave alive. I promise you that. He won't come. He doesn't know where I am. You sure? No. Well, the admission cost her. But what am I supposed to do? Spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder? You're supposed to live and know that if he does come, he'll have to go through me first. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. Why are you so good to me? Because you deserve it. And because... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Because what? Because I love you. The words came out rough, unpracticed. I didn't want to, tried not to, but I do. She kissed him then, salt from her tears mixing with the taste of her mouth, and they made love slowly in the pre-dawn darkness, reaffirming what they'd built in this small space against all logic and reason. After, lying tangled together as the first gray light crept through the window, Lydia said, When spring comes, what happens to us? What do you want to happen? I want to stay, but I don't know if that's smart or stupid or just me being scared to face the world again. Caleb thought about it, about the careful life he'd built here, the solitude he'd treasured, about how none of that meant anything anymore compared to the woman in his arms. Stay, he said, not because you're scared, because you want to, because this... He gestured at the cabin, at them, at everything they'd become. Because this is worth keeping. You mean that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. She settled against him, her breathing evening out. Okay, then I'll stay. March came in like a promise that winter might actually end someday. The temperatures rose just enough that the brutal edge came off the cold. The snow stopped falling every single day, and one morning Caleb woke to the sound of water dripping, the first real thaw, the roof letting go of its burden. Listen, he said, shaking Lydia awake. What? She was groggy, annoyed at being woken. Just listen. She did. Her eyes widened. Is that... Snow melt. Spring's coming. They got up and stood at the window, watching water drip from the eaves, and it felt like witnessing a miracle. 4 months of nothing but accumulation, and now finally, the release. How long until the pass is clear? Lydia asked. 6 weeks? Maybe 8? Depends on how fast it warms up. He put his arm around her shoulders. Why? Just planning. But she leaned into him, and Caleb knew she was thinking the same thing he was, that spring meant change, meant decisions, meant facing a world that wasn't just the two of them anymore. The thaw brought other changes, too. The trap line became accessible again, and Caleb started checking it daily, bringing back rabbits and the occasional fox. The increased game meant better meals, which improved both their moods. Lydia started talking about a garden, pointing out where she could plant once the ground thawed, listing vegetables they could grow. You know how to garden? Caleb asked. My mother had one. I helped. She was sketching plans in the dirt by the barn using a stick to mark out rows. We could do potatoes here, beans there, maybe some squash if the season's long enough. It's not. We get maybe 90 days between frosts up here. Then we'll work with what we've got. She looked up at him and there was something fierce in her expression. I'm not leaving, Caleb, which means we need to think long term. A garden helps with that. He looked at her plans, crude but practical, and felt something settle in his chest. She wasn't just saying she'd stay. She was planning for it, building toward it. Okay, he said, we'll plant a garden. Her smile could have melted the rest of the snow right then and there. But spring also brought complications. The warmer weather meant Stubb needed exercise, which meant Caleb needed to clear a path for riding, which meant he'd eventually need to go to town for summer supplies, which meant people would know Lydia had stayed. Does it matter? Lydia asked when he brought it up. What people think? Might. Small towns talk, and you staying here with me, unmarried. He trailed off, not sure how to finish that. You worried about my reputation? She sounded amused. I'm worried about you getting hurt by small-minded people who don't know when to keep their mouths shut. I've survived worse than gossip. Have you survived being run out of town? Because that's what could happen if the church ladies decide you're a fallen woman and I'm, what's the phrase they use, living in sin. Lydia set down the shirt she was mending. So what are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying it's something to think about. Are you asking me to marry you? The question hit him like a physical blow. What? Because that's what it sounds like you're dancing around. worried about my reputation, worried about what people will say. If we're married, none of that matters. That's not... I wasn't... Caleb stopped, gathered his thoughts. If I ask you to marry me, it won't be because I'm worried about gossip. Then why would you? Because I want to. Because you deserve better than being called my housekeeper or my... He couldn't even say the word. Because if you're staying, I want it to be real, legal, something nobody can take away or question. Lydia stood, crossed to where he sat. Caleb Rourke, are you asking me to marry you? He looked up at her, this woman who'd turned his carefully ordered life into something messy and complicated and infinitely better. Yeah, I guess I am. That's the worst proposal I've ever heard. It's the only one you're getting. She laughed, that full-throated sound that still surprised him every time. Then I guess I better say yes before you come to your senses. Is that a yes? It's a yes. She cupped his face in her hands. But we're doing it right, not just some quick thing to satisfy the town gossips. If we're getting married, we're doing it proper. What does proper mean? It means we go to town when the pass is clear. We find a preacher or a justice of the peace or whoever does it. We say the words in front of witnesses, and then we come back here as husband and wife, and nobody can say a damn thing about it. Caleb pulled her into his lap, felt her arms go around his neck. You sure about this? Because once we do it, you're stuck with me. I'm already stuck with you. This just makes it official. They kissed, and it felt like sealing a promise, like taking all the broken pieces of their pasts and forging them into something new. That night, lying in bed with Lydia's head on his chest, Caleb said, I never thought I'd do this again. Get married? Any of it. Feel this way. Want someone to stay. Build a life with another person. He stroked her hair. After Sarah died, I was done. Convinced myself I was better off alone. What changed? You did. You showed up and wouldn't leave and somehow made me remember what it felt like to want something besides just getting through the day. Lydia propped herself up to look at him. I was so angry when you offered to help me. Thought you were like every other man I'd met, looking for something in return. What made you say yes? Honestly, I was too tired to care if you were lying. Figured if you tried something, I'd kill you and take my chances in the cabin alone. She smiled slightly. Turns out you were exactly what you said you were. Stubborn, practical, and decent enough not to expect anything I wasn't willing to give. High praise. It's the truth. She kissed him softly. You saved my life, Caleb. Not just from freezing to death, but from giving up. I'd stopped believing anything good could happen. And then you happened. We happened. Yeah, we did. April brought mud and rain and the slow, messy business of the world thawing out. The snow retreated to the high peaks, leaving behind soggy ground and swollen streams. The garden plot Lydia had planned became a reality, and they spent days breaking up the soil, working in what manure they could spare from Stubbs' stall, getting it ready for planting. You really think anything will grow up here? Caleb asked, watching Lydia work with a determination that bordered on obsessive. It'll grow if I have to threaten it personally. She drove the spade into the ground with more force than necessary. We need fresh vegetables, Caleb. I'm going crazy with nothing but dried beans and salt pork. We've got some canned goods left. Not the same. She stood, wiped sweat from her forehead. I need something green, something that tastes like life instead of survival. He understood that better than he wanted to admit. Okay, we'll make it work. And they did. Lydia planted potatoes and beans, some lettuce seeds she'd saved from town, even a few squash plants that probably wouldn't make it, but deserved a chance anyway. She watered and weeded and watched over that garden like it was the most important thing in the world. Caleb watched her work and thought about the future, the real future, not just getting through the next winter. A future with Lydia as his wife, with a garden that grew every year, maybe with kids someday if they were lucky. It was a future he'd stopped believing in 14 years ago, but now it felt possible again. The passes cleared in late April, earlier than expected. Caleb stood at the edge of the high trail, looking down at where the snow had finally released its grip, and felt both relief and apprehension. Relief because they'd made it through. Apprehension because now came the hard part, facing the world again. You ready for this? Lydia asked. She'd insisted on coming with him to check the trail, and now stood beside him looking at the path down. No, but we're doing it anyway. They rode down together 2 days later, Lydia on stub and Caleb walking alongside. The trip took most of the day, and by the time they reached Copper Hollow, the sun was setting and casting everything in gold. The town looked the same, maybe a little smaller, a little more worn, but fundamentally unchanged. Caleb tied Stubb outside Morrison's and helped Lydia down, acutely aware of the eyes already watching them from windows and doorways. "Let them look," Lydia muttered, taking his arm. Morrison's face when they walked in together was almost worth the trip. His eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, and he set down the ledger he'd been working on. "Well," he said, "didn't expect to see both of you." "Lydia stayed the winter," Caleb said, stating the obvious, but it needed to be said. "I can see that." Morrison's eyes went to where Lydia's hand rested on Caleb's arm. "Everything work out okay up there?" "Better than okay," Lydia said, her voice clear and firm. "We're getting married. That's why we're here, to find whoever can do it legal." Morrison's expression shifted from shock to something that might have been approval. "That's so?" "That's so," Caleb confirmed. "You know who we need to talk to?" "Judge Hendricks handles that sort of thing. He's probably at the saloon this time of day." Morrison paused. "You sure about this, Caleb? No offense, miss, but you two have known each other, what, 5 months?" "Long enough," Caleb said. "You got a problem with it?" "Not my business if I did," but Morrison smiled slightly. "Congratulations, then, both of you." They found Judge Hendricks exactly where Morrison said he'd be, working through his second whiskey of the evening. He was a weathered man in his 60s, with sharp eyes and a sharper mind despite the drinking. "Marriage license?" He looked them over. "You two even know each other's middle names?" "Don't need to," Lydia said. "We know everything that matters." "That's what they all say," but Hendricks pulled out the necessary paperwork. "You'll need witnesses, 2 of them." "We'll find them," Caleb said. "And there's a waiting period." "How long?" 3 days. Caleb looked at Lydia. She nodded. "We can wait 3 days." They found a room at the boarding house, separate rooms, at Lydia's insistence since they weren't married yet, and spent the next 3 days in a strange limbo. Caleb restocked supplies at Morrison's, getting everything they'd need for the summer. Lydia bought fabric and thread, some seeds for the garden, a few luxuries they couldn't get in the mountains. And they dealt with the questions, the stares, the church ladies who cornered Lydia outside the dry goods store and asked pointed questions about propriety and whether she understood what she was getting into, marrying a hermit who'd been alone so long. "I understand exactly what I'm getting into," Lydia told them, her voice polite but cold as ice. "A good man who treats me with respect. If you've got a problem with that, keep it to yourselves." The ladies scattered like chickens. That night, Caleb found her sitting on the steps of the boarding house, looking out at the street. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine, just tired of people acting like I don't know my own mind." He sat beside her. "You can still change it. The mind, I mean, if you're having second thoughts." "I'm not." She looked at him. "Are you?" "No. But I want you to be sure, because once we do this, you're stuck with me and that mountain and a life that's harder than most people want to handle." "Caleb?" She took his hand. "I spent 6 months married to a man who hit me, 3 months running from his brother, and the last 5 months with you have been the happiest of my life, even counting the parts where I thought I'd freeze to death or go crazy from cabin fever. So yeah, I'm sure." "Okay then." "Okay then." She leaned against his shoulder. 3 more days. The wedding happened on a Thursday afternoon in Judge Hendricks's office, with Morrison and his wife as witnesses. It wasn't fancy. Lydia wore the best dress she'd bought from the dry goods store, and Caleb had cleaned up as much as a mountain man could. But when they stood together and said the words, it felt more real than anything either of them had done in years. "Do you, Caleb Rourke, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "And do you, Lydia Vale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. You can kiss her if you want." Caleb did, and Lydia kissed him back, and Morrison's wife dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. They signed the license, made it official, and that night, finally legal and proper, they shared a room at the boarding house and celebrated the way married people did. The next morning, they loaded up Stubb and headed back to the mountain. The town watched them go, and Caleb knew they'd be talking about it for months. The hermit who'd finally taken a wife, the woman who'd chosen isolation over society. Let them talk. He had everything he needed right here. They reached the cabin in the late afternoon, and Lydia stood looking at it like she was seeing it for the first time. "What?" Caleb asked. "It looks different." "It's the same cabin it was a week ago." "No, it's not." She turned to him, smiling. "A week ago it was your cabin. Now it's ours." Ours. The word settled into Caleb's chest, warm and solid. He pulled her close, kissed her properly. "Welcome home, Mrs. Rourke." "Home," Lydia repeated, tasting the word. "Yeah, I like the sound of that." Summer came to the mountain like a gift they hadn't expected. The garden that Lydia had threatened into existence actually grew. Not perfectly. Some of the lettuce bolted in the heat and half the squash plants died. But there were potatoes pushing up through the soil and bean vines climbing the poles Caleb had set, and the sight of green growing things made Lydia happier than he'd seen her yet. "Look at this," she'd say every morning, dragging him out to inspect some new leaf or bud. "We're actually doing it." "You're doing it," Caleb corrected. "I just dug the holes where you told me to." "We're a team. That means we both get credit." Team. Another word that settled into his bones and made itself at home. They were a team now, legally and actually, and the rhythm they'd developed over the winter deepened into something more permanent. Caleb built an addition onto the cabin. Just a small room, but it gave them space for storage and made the main room less cramped. Lydia sewed curtains from the fabric she'd bought in town, made the place feel less like a survival shelter and more like somewhere people actually lived. They worked the trap line together now, Lydia proving she had a knack for reading animal signs that rivaled Caleb's own. She could look at a track and tell him not just what had made it, but how long ago and whether it was worth following. Her shooting had gotten good enough that she brought down a deer in late June, a clean shot that dropped it where it stood. "That's better than I could have done," Caleb said, field dressing the animal while Lydia stood guard with the rifle. "You taught me well." "I taught you the basics. The rest is all you." She looked pleased at that, and Caleb realized he'd been giving her compliments more freely lately. Not false praise, Lydia would have called him on that immediately, but genuine recognition of her skills. She'd earned them, but summer also brought the thing they'd both been half expecting and wholly dreading. They were checking the trap line on a Thursday morning in July when Caleb noticed the tracks. Boot prints, fresh, coming up from the lower trail. Too big to be Lydia's, too new to be his own from previous trips. "Someone's here," he said quietly. Lydia went still. "Where?" "Came up from the south, maybe 2-3 hours ago based on how the edges have settled." He studied the tracks, reading the story they told. Single person. Heavy. Male, probably. Moving slow but steady. Headed toward the cabin? "Looks like it." Caleb pulled his rifle from its sling. "Stay behind me. If I tell you to run, you run. Don't argue. Don't wait. Just go." "Caleb, promise me." She set her jaw in that stubborn way he knew well. "I'm not leaving you." "Lydia, if this is who I think it might be, then we face him together." She checked her own rifle, her movements quick and competent. "I'm done running. Whatever this is, we handle it." They moved through the forest quietly, Caleb in the lead and Lydia close behind. The tracks led exactly where he'd feared, straight to the cabin. And when they came within sight of the clearing, they saw him. A man stood in front of the cabin door, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in trail clothes that had seen better days. He was trying the door handle, testing to see if it was locked. As they watched, he cupped his hands and peered through the window. "Marcus," Lydia breathed, and Caleb felt her go rigid beside him. "You sure?" "I'd know him anywhere." Her voice was flat, dead. "How did he find me?" "Doesn't matter. He's leaving." Caleb stepped out of the tree line, his rifle raised but not quite pointed. "You. Step away from the cabin." Marcus spun, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip. But he froze when he saw the rifle, his eyes going from Caleb to Lydia and back again. "Well," he said. His voice was smooth, educated, nothing like Caleb had expected. "This is unexpected. Lydia, darling, you've been busy." "Don't call me that." Lydia moved up beside Caleb, her own rifle now pointed directly at Marcus's chest. How did you find me? Does it matter? I'm here now. Marcus spread his hands, all reasonable charm. I've been looking for you for months. Do you have any idea how worried I've been? Worried about your property, you mean? That's harsh. I prefer to think of it as concern for my late brother's wife. Widow, Caleb said, and she's not your concern anymore. She's mine. Now get off my land before I give you a reason to leave faster. Marcus's eyes narrowed. And who exactly are you? Her husband, legal and proper, signed and witnessed, which means whatever claim you think you had died the moment she said, I do. Now move. For a moment, Marcus just stared. Then he laughed, but it had an ugly edge. Husband. How convenient. Tell me, did you know what you were getting? A woman who watched her husband die and didn't shed a tear. Who ran out on her responsibilities the moment things got difficult? I know exactly what I got, Caleb said. A woman who survived a bad marriage and a worse brother-in-law. A woman strong enough to walk away from a man who thought he owned her. That's all I need to know. Strong, Marcus's lip curled. Is that what she told you? Did she mention the money James borrowed from me? The debts that came due when he died? I don't care about your money. You should. It's a considerable sum. And legally, as James's widow, Lydia inherited those debts along with everything else. That's not how debt works, Lydia said. I checked. In this territory, a widow isn't responsible for her husband's debts unless she signed the contract herself, which I didn't. Marcus's expression flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. He hadn't expected her to know that. Legalities aside, he said, recovering smoothly, there's still the matter of family obligation. James was my brother. You were his wife. That creates certain expectations. The only expectation I have, Lydia said, her voice cold as winter ice, is that you'll leave here and never come back. Otherwise, I'll shoot you myself and will bury you where nobody will ever find the body. You wouldn't dare. Try me. They stood like that for a long moment, tension crackling in the air. Then Marcus laughed again, but it sounded forced. This is absurd. You can't just hide up here forever, Lydia. Eventually you'll have to come down. And when we do, Caleb interrupted, we'll be together. And if you're anywhere near Copper Hollow when that happens, I'll make sure the sheriff knows you've been threatening my wife. Harassment, stalking, whatever charge sticks. You'll be the one who ends up buried, just not literally. Marcus's mask of charm was cracking now, showing the ugliness underneath. You think you can protect her? You think some mountain hermit with a rifle is going to stop me from collecting what I'm owed? I think, Caleb said, stepping forward, that you're on my land with a gun on your hip and threats on your tongue. That gives me every legal right to defend my property and my wife. So here's how this is going to work. You're going to turn around, walk back down that trail, and get on whatever horse you rode in on. And you're going to keep walking until you're so far away that even thinking about coming back seems like a bad idea. Because if I see you again, if I even hear that you've been asking questions about Lydia in town, I won't bother with the sheriff. I'll handle it myself. Is that a threat? It's a promise. For the first time, something like fear flickered across Marcus's face. He looked at Caleb, really looked at him, and seemed to recognize something in his eyes. The kind of quiet certainty that came from a man who'd killed before and would do it again if necessary. Fine, Marcus said. You want to play house in the wilderness with damaged goods? That's your funeral. But this isn't over, Lydia. You can't hide from your past forever. I'm not hiding, Lydia said. I'm living. There's a difference. Marcus turned and walked toward the trees, his movements stiff with suppressed anger. But before he disappeared into the forest, he looked back. You'll regret this, he said. I already regret ever meeting you, Lydia replied. Now get out. They watched until he was gone, the sound of his passage fading into the normal forest noise. Even then, they waited, rifles ready, until Caleb was certain he was really leaving. He's gone, Caleb said finally. Lydia lowered her rifle. Her hands were shaking. Hey, Caleb set his own rifle down and pulled her close. You did good. You stood your ground. I wanted to shoot him. Her voice was muffled against his chest. The whole time he was talking, I was thinking about how easy it would be to just pull the trigger. But you didn't. That's what matters. Is it? She pulled back to look at him. Because part of me wishes I had. Just to be done with it. To know he can't ever come back. He won't come back. He knows now that you're not alone and you're not defenseless. Men like him are cowards. They only go after people who can't fight back. You don't know that. I know his type. Seen plenty of them in my life. Caleb cupped her face in his hands. And I meant what I said. If he comes back, I'll handle it. Whatever it takes. That's what scares me. Her eyes searched his. I don't want you to have to kill someone because of me. It wouldn't be because of you. It would be because he forced the choice. Caleb kissed her forehead. But it won't come to that. He's gone, and he's staying gone. They went inside the cabin, both of them needing the familiar space and solid walls. Lydia checked every window, every corner, making sure nothing had been disturbed. Caleb found the scratches on the door where Marcus had tried to pry it open and made a mental note to add a stronger lock. That night, Lydia couldn't sleep. She lay rigid in the bed, every small noise making her tense. He's not coming back tonight, Caleb said. You don't know that. I do. He's probably still walking down the mountain, cursing every step. And even if he wanted to try something, he won't do it in the dark in unfamiliar territory. He's not that stupid. You sure? I'm sure. Caleb pulled her closer. Try to sleep. I'll keep watch if it makes you feel better. You need sleep too. I've gone longer on less. It's fine. But Lydia shifted to face him, her expression serious in the moonlight filtering through the window. Caleb, what if he does come back? What if next time he brings help, or waits until we're in town, or... Then we deal with it, together. He stroked her hair. That's what marriage is, right? Facing the bad stuff together instead of alone. I never wanted to bring this kind of trouble to you. You didn't bring it, it followed you. There's a difference. He kissed her softly. Besides, you think my life was trouble-free before you showed up? I was slowly dying of loneliness up here and too stubborn to admit it. You saved me just as much as I saved you, maybe more. That's not true. It is. You made me remember what it felt like to be human, to want something besides just surviving. That's worth fighting for. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I love you. I love you too. Now sleep. We've got a garden to tend in the morning, and those beans aren't going to harvest themselves. She laughed softly, and finally, eventually, she slept. The next few weeks passed in a strange combination of normal routine and heightened awareness. They went about their daily work, tending the garden, checking traps, maintaining the cabin. But Caleb noticed that Lydia always had a rifle within reach now. She'd check the tree line more often, pause to listen to sounds that probably meant nothing. He didn't tell her to relax. Couldn't, really, when he was doing the same thing. Instead, he taught her more about tracking, about reading signs that someone had passed through, how to set up an early warning system using string and bells around the cabin's perimeter, small things that made her feel more in control. The garden helped too. Hard to stay paranoid when you were up to your elbows in dirt, pulling weeds and checking for pests. And when the first beans came in, ready to pick, Lydia's whoop of triumph echoed across the clearing. Look at this! She held up a handful of green beans like they were gold. We did it! We actually grew food! Caleb grinned at her enthusiasm. Told you it would work. You told me it probably wouldn't work. Don't rewrite history. But she was smiling, that full genuine smile that made something in his chest warm. We're having these for dinner, fresh beans. Real, actual, fresh beans. They did, and it was the best meal they'd had in months. Not because the beans were particularly special, though they were good, but because they represented something. Proof that they could build a life here that was more than just survival. That they could grow things, make things, create something permanent. After dinner, they sat outside watching the sunset paint the peaks gold and purple. Lydia leaned against Caleb's shoulder, content in a way she hadn't been since Marcus's visit. You know what I was thinking? She said. What? We should expand the garden next year. Plant more. Maybe get some chickens if we can manage it. Build up our supplies so we're not so dependent on town. You want chickens. I want fresh eggs, and chickens are easier than a cow. You want a cow too? Eventually. Maybe. Is that crazy? Caleb thought about it. A year ago, the idea of expanding anything would have seemed insane. But now, with Lydia planning for next year and the year after that, it felt right. Not crazy, he said. Ambitious, but not crazy. So we can do it? We can try. Can't promise the chickens will survive the winter, but we can try. She kissed his cheek. Thank you. For what? For not thinking I'm ridiculous for planning like this. For believing we can actually build something here. Lydia, you turned a pile of dirt into a working garden through sheer stubbornness. If you say we can have chickens and a cow, I believe you. August brought heat that felt impossible at this altitude. The air turned thick and close, and afternoon thunderstorms rolled through almost daily, violent and brief. During one particularly bad storm, lightning struck a tree about 100 yards from the cabin, splitting it down the middle with a crack that sounded like the world breaking. They stood in the doorway watching it burn despite the rain, and Caleb felt Lydia tense beside him. That could have been the cabin, she said. But it wasn't. This time. What about next time? Or the time after that? He understood what she wasn't saying. The mountain was beautiful, but it was also dangerous. Fire, lightning, cold, isolation. 100 things that could kill them if they weren't careful. And now they were talking about building something permanent here, about bringing animals and eventually maybe children into this harsh place. We'll be careful, Caleb said. We'll prepare for what we can and handle the rest as it comes, same as we've been doing. Is that enough? It's all anyone can do wherever they live. You think people in town don't face danger? Disease, accidents, violence, bad things happen everywhere. At least here we're in control of most of it. She nodded slowly. I know, I want this to work. Want us to work. And sometimes I'm scared that the mountain will take it all away. Then we hold on tighter. He pulled her close. The mountain's been trying to kill me for 14 years and hasn't managed it yet. It's not going to start now. That made her smile. You're stubborn enough to outlive the mountain itself. Damn right. The storm passed, leaving everything washed clean and smelling of ozone and wet pine. They went out to check for damage and found the garden had weathered it fine, the sturdy poles Caleb had set holding against the wind. September arrived with cooler nights and the first hints of color in the aspens. They spent their days putting up food for winter, canning the vegetables from the garden, smoking meat from Caleb's hunting, gathering wild berries and roots. It was hard work, but satisfying in a way that transcended the physical labor. This is what I wanted, Lydia said one evening, her hands stained purple from berry juice. When I was married to James, when I was running from Marcus, this is what I dreamed about. A place where I could work hard and see the results, where nobody owned me or hurt me or made me feel small. You're not small. You never were. I felt small, like I didn't matter except for what I could do for other people. She looked at him. You make me feel big, important, like I take up space in the world, and that's a good thing. Caleb didn't have words for how that made him feel, so he just kissed her, tasting berries and summer and the future they were building together. In early October, Caleb made a trip to town alone. Lydia had argued about it, wanted to come with him, worried about Marcus, but they needed supplies before the passes closed, and someone had to stay to watch the cabin and tend the animals. They'd gotten 3 chickens in August, against all odds, and Lydia was fiercely protective of them. I'll be fine, Caleb assured her. Down and back in 2 days, 3 at most. If you're not back in 4, I'm coming after you. Fair enough. He made it to Copper Hollow by late afternoon, the town settling into its evening routine. Morrison greeted him with a raised eyebrow when he walked into the store alone. Lydia didn't come. Stayed at the cabin. Someone needs to watch the place. Everything okay up there? Heard there was a stranger asking questions about you two back in July. So the word had gotten around. Caleb wasn't surprised. Nothing we couldn't handle, he said. He left, won't be coming back. Morrison nodded slowly. You need any help with that? You let me know. You and Lydia are good people. Town looks after its own. The casual acceptance in those words hit Caleb harder than he'd expected. For 14 years, he'd been the hermit, the outsider, the man who lived alone and wanted nothing to do with anyone. But somewhere along the line, probably the moment he'd walked down that mountain with Lydia as his wife, that had changed. Appreciate it, Caleb said. He gathered his supplies, chatted briefly with a few other townspeople who'd heard about the marriage and wanted to offer congratulations, and was loading up Stubb when Judge Hendricks found him. Rourke, got a minute? What do you need, Judge? Hendricks looked uncomfortable. That man who was asking about your wife, he came to see me. Wanted to know about annulment laws, whether a marriage could be invalidated if one party was coerced. Caleb's blood went cold. What did you tell him? The truth. That coercion has to be proven, and a marriage performed in my office with witnesses is as legal as they come. But he was... Hendricks paused. He was asking other questions too, about property rights, about what happens to a man's holdings if he dies without a will. He was asking about me specifically? Didn't use names, but yeah, I think he was fishing to see what would happen if you weren't around anymore. Caleb felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. Thanks for telling me. Watch your back, Rourke. Man like that, asking those kinds of questions, he's planning something. Let him plan. He comes at me or mine. He won't leave alive. Hendricks nodded. Just make sure you can prove it with self-defense. I like you and Lydia, but I can't help you if you murder someone in cold blood. It won't be murder. It'll be protection. Caleb rode back up the mountain faster than was probably safe, pushing Stubb harder than he liked. The whole way his mind churned through possibilities. Marcus asking about annulment, about property rights. Building a legal case or looking for loopholes, which meant he hadn't given up, was probably planning another move. He reached the cabin just after dark on the second day, and Lydia met him at the door with a rifle. It's me, he called out. She lowered the gun, relief flooding her face. You're early. Something came up. He tied Stubb and brought the supplies inside, then told her everything Hendricks had said. Lydia listened, her expression growing grimmer with each word. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. He wants you dead, she said finally. That's what all those questions were about. If you die, he thinks I'll be vulnerable again. That he can swoop in and what? Force me to marry him? Take over whatever property we have? That's what I figure. So what do we do? Caleb looked at her, this woman who'd survived so much already, who'd built a life here through sheer determination. The thought of Marcus threatening her, made something primal wake up in his chest. We prepare, he said. We make sure we're never vulnerable. We watch each other's backs. And if he shows up here again, we end it. Permanently. Lydia nodded slowly. Okay, then that's what we do. They spent the rest of October preparing for whatever might come. Caleb taught Lydia more about defensive tactics, about how to fortify the cabin, about shooting to kill versus shooting to wound. They set up better warning systems around the property, and they made sure they were never both away from the cabin at the same time. But Marcus didn't come. The weeks passed and the aspens turned gold and the first snow fell, and still no sign of him. Maybe he gave up, Lydia said one evening. Maybe. But Caleb didn't believe it. Men like Marcus didn't give up. They just waited for the right opportunity. November came, and with it the familiar routine of battening down for winter. They'd learned from last year, had more supplies, more firewood, more of everything they'd need to survive the brutal months ahead. The chickens were settled in a coop attached to the barn, and they had enough food put by that they probably wouldn't even need to check the trapline until January. We're ready, Lydia said, surveying their stores. Whatever comes, we're ready for it. Caleb hoped she was right. The first real storm of winter hit in mid-December, 3 days of howling wind and snow that buried the cabin up to the window frames. They'd been through it before, knew the routine, but this time felt different. Heavier somehow, like the weather itself was holding its breath. On the fourth day, when the storm finally broke and they could dig themselves out, Caleb found the tracks. They came from the South Trail, same as before. But this time there were 2 sets, both fresh from sometime during the storm. Both headed toward the cabin, then circling it, then disappearing back into the trees. Someone was here, he said, studying the prints. 2 of them, during the worst of it. Lydia stood beside him, her rifle already in her hands. Marcus? One set's about the right size, the other's bigger. He brought help. Why didn't they try to get in? Because we were awake and armed, and they're not stupid enough to assault a defended position. Caleb followed the tracks with his eyes, reading the story they told. They were scouting, figuring out our patterns, our defenses, planning. For what? For when we're vulnerable. He looked at her. We need to change how we do things. No more both of us sleeping at the same time. No more predictable schedules. And we don't go anywhere alone. Not even to the barn. Lydia's jaw tightened. I'm not going to live like a prisoner in my own home. You're not. You're living like someone who's being hunted. There's a difference. Is there? But she knew he was right. They both did. That night, Caleb took first watch while Lydia slept fitfully in the loft. He sat by the window with his rifle across his lap, watching the moonlight on the snow and thinking about the choices that had led him here. A year ago, he'd been alone, safe in his isolation, untouchable in his grief. Now he had something worth protecting, which meant he had something to lose. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it just made him angry. Marcus had no right to this. No right to threaten Lydia, no right to invade their home, no right to try and take away the life they'd built. And if he came back, when he came back, Caleb would make sure he understood that. Around 3 a.m, Stubb whinnied from the barn, not his usual complaint about cold or hunger, but a sharp sound of alarm. Caleb was on his feet instantly, checking the loads in his rifle. Lydia? He called up to the loft. Wake up. Something's wrong. She was down the ladder in seconds, her own rifle ready. What is it? Stubbs spooked. Stay here. Keep the door barred. I'm going to check. Like hell you are. We do this together, remember? He wanted to argue, wanted to keep her safe inside where walls could protect her. But he'd promised they were a team, and that meant trusting her to watch his back. Okay, but stay close and keep your eyes open. They moved out into the night, the cold hitting like a fist. The barn was maybe 30 yards away, and every step felt exposed, vulnerable. Caleb's eyes swept the tree line, looking for movement, for anything out of place. The barn door was ajar. Caleb had closed it himself before bed. He always did, which meant someone had opened it. Wait here, he whispered to Lydia. Before she could protest, he added, Cover me. If anyone comes out of those trees, shoot them. He approached the barn slowly, rifle up, every sense straining. Inside, Stubb was making distressed sounds, his hooves stamping nervously. Caleb eased the door open wider, letting moonlight spill in. The barn looked empty, but Stubb was backed into the far corner of his stall, eyes rolling white. And on the floor near the door, scratched into the dirt, was a message. Soon. Just that. One word. A promise and a threat. Caleb? Lydia's voice was tight with fear. It's clear. But come look at this. She came in, saw the message, and went pale. He was here, in our barn while we were sleeping. Not while we were sleeping, while I was on watch. Caleb felt rage building. He's trying to prove a point, that he can get close whenever he wants, that we're not safe. Are we? We are now, because now we know he's here, and we're ready for him. They spent the rest of the night fortifying the cabin. Caleb rigged up tripwires around the perimeter with bells attached, crude but effective. They moved supplies into the cabin from the barn so they wouldn't have to make that trip as often. And they made a plan. If he comes during the day, Caleb said, we have the advantage. We can see him coming, we know the terrain. But if he comes at night, then we make sure one of us is always awake and watching. Lydia checked the loads in both rifles, her movements mechanical. We take shifts, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, and we keep the fire going so we have light. That'll burn through our wood faster. I don't care. I'd rather freeze in March than die in December. It was a grim way to live, and they both knew it. But what choice did they have? Run? Where would they go? This was their home, their land, their life. They'd built it from nothing, and they weren't giving it up without a fight. Christmas came and went unmarked. They were too exhausted from the constant vigilance, too worn down by the fear that every sound might be Marcus coming to finish what he'd started. New Year's passed the same way, just another day of watching and waiting and wondering when the other shoe would drop. It finally did on January 7th. Caleb was on watch, sitting by the window in the pre-dawn darkness, when he saw movement at the tree line. Two shapes, darker than the shadows, moving toward the cabin with the careful coordination of men who'd planned this. Lydia, he said quietly. They're here. She was awake instantly, rifle in hand. Where? East side. 2 of them, coming slow. Caleb's heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. This was it, the moment they'd been preparing for. You remember the plan? I remember. The plan was simple. Caleb would cover the front, Lydia the back. If they had to shoot, they'd shoot to kill. No warnings, no second chances, just survival. The shapes got closer. Caleb could make out details now, Marcus in the lead, another man behind him, both armed, both moving like they knew what they were doing. When they were about 20 yards out, Marcus called out, "Rourke, I know you're awake. Come out and talk like civilized people." But Caleb didn't answer, didn't move, just kept his rifle trained on Marcus's chest. "Fine, Charkun," Marcus said. "Have it your way. But you should know, I've filed paperwork in Denver, claims against this land, questions about the validity of your marriage, all of it. Even if you shoot me, it won't matter. The law's already looking into you." "He's lying," Lydia whispered. "Probably, but maybe not." Caleb's mind raced. If Marcus really had filed legal challenges, killing him might just make things worse. But if he hadn't, if this was just a bluff... "I want Lydia," Marcus called out. "That's all. You let her go, walk away from this, and I'll drop everything. You can keep your little mountain hideaway. Hell, I'll even pay you for the inconvenience. But she's coming with me." "Not happening," Caleb shouted back. "Then you're both dead. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But I've got time and resources, and you've got nothing but snow and stubbornness. How long do you think you can last?" Lydia moved up beside Caleb, her expression fierce. "Long enough to watch you freeze to death out there. Now get off our land before we make you." Marcus laughed. "There she is, the woman who thinks she can escape her past by playing house in the wilderness. Tell me, Lydia, does he know about the baby?" The words hit like a thunderclap. Caleb felt Lydia go rigid beside him. "What baby?" he asked quietly. "The one she lost," Marcus said. "James's baby. She was 3 months pregnant when he died. Lost it a week later from the stress. Or that's what she told people anyway. Convenient timing, wasn't it?" "Shut up." Lydia's voice was shaking. "Did you ever tell your new husband about that? About how you got rid of the last piece of my brother because you couldn't be bothered? I said shut up." Lydia's rifle cracked, the shot going wide but close enough to make Marcus dive for cover. "I lost that baby because I was starving and scared, and your brother had beaten me so badly the week before that I could barely stand. Don't you dare make it sound like it was my choice." Caleb's world tilted. Lydia had been pregnant, had lost a child, had carried that pain alone all this time and never said a word. "Lydia," he started. "Not now." Her voice was hard as iron. "We deal with him first, then we talk." Marcus was back on his feet, using a tree for cover. "Doesn't matter why it happened. Point is, you've got history, secrets, things your mountain man here doesn't know about. How long before he starts wondering what else you've been hiding?" "I know everything I need to know," Caleb said. "And you've got about 10 seconds to leave before I stop aiming to miss." "You won't shoot. You're too civilized for that." "Try me." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Marcus's companion, who'd been silent this whole time, said, "Marcus, this is crazy. Let's just go." "We're not leaving without her." "She doesn't want to go, and this guy looks like he'll actually do it. I didn't sign up to get killed over your dead brother's wife. She owes me. She doesn't owe you anything." The man stepped out from behind his tree, hands raised. "I'm out. Do what you want, but I'm going back to Denver while I still can." He started walking away, and after a moment's hesitation, Marcus followed. But before he disappeared into the trees, he turned back. "This isn't over," he called out. "Yeah, it is," Caleb replied. "Don't come back." They watched until Marcus and his companion were gone, swallowed by the forest. Even then, they waited, making sure it wasn't a trick. When the sun finally rose and there was still no sign of them, Caleb lowered his rifle. "Lydia, I should have told you." She wouldn't look at him. "About the baby. About all of it. I couldn't find the words." "Come inside. We need to talk." They went in, barred the door, and stood in the weak morning light, not quite looking at each other. Finally, Lydia spoke. "His name was James Vale. We got married in St. Louis when I was 22. He seemed kind at first, attentive, By the time I realized what he really was, I was already trapped. She set down her rifle with shaking hands. He hit me for the first time 3 weeks after the wedding, said I'd embarrassed him at a dinner party. After that, it was something new every week. I burned dinner. I spoke out of turn. I looked at another man. Always something. Caleb listened, his chest tight. I found out I was pregnant in May. Thought maybe it would change things, make him better. It just made him worse. He got jealous, paranoid, said the baby probably wasn't his. Beat me so badly one night I couldn't get out of bed for 2 days. Her voice cracked. A week later I started bleeding. Lost the baby at 3 months. The midwife said it was from the trauma, that my body couldn't sustain the pregnancy after what he'd done. Lydia, I'm so sorry. James died 2 weeks after that, bar fight, like I told you, and I should have felt something, grief, relief, anything, but I just felt empty, like I died with that baby and just forgotten to stop breathing. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were full of unshed tears. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I was afraid you'd think I was damaged, broken, that you'd look at me different if you knew. Caleb crossed to her, pulled her into his arms. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed against him, sobbing. You're not broken, he said fiercely. You survived. That's the opposite of broken. I lost a baby. Because a monster hurt you. That's not your fault. None of it was your fault. I should have left him sooner. Should have nothing. You did what you had to do to survive. That's all anyone can do. He pulled back to look at her. And for the record, knowing this doesn't change how I feel about you. If anything, it makes me love you more. Because you went through all that and you're still here, still fighting, still building a life. That takes more strength than I've got. That's not true. It is. You're the strongest person I know, Lydia Rourke, and I'm honored that you chose to build a life with me. She kissed him then, hard and desperate, and they held each other while the sun climbed higher and the fear slowly drained away. That afternoon, Caleb made a decision. We're going to town, he said. What? Why? Because Marcus said he filed paperwork. We need to find out if that's true, and if it is, we need to fight it properly. Legal, official, so there's no question about this place or our marriage or any of it. But the snow, we'll manage. We've got snowshoes and the trail's not completely closed. It'll be hard, but we can do it. Together? She asked. Always together. They packed light and left the next morning, leaving the chickens with enough food and water to last a week. The trip down took 2 full days of brutal hiking through waist-deep snow, but they made it. And when they walked into Morrison's store, snow-covered and exhausted, his eyes went wide. Didn't expect to see you until spring. We've got a problem, Caleb said. Need to see Judge Hendricks. It's urgent. The judge listened to everything, about Marcus, the threats, the claims about legal paperwork. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. I did receive some documents from a lawyer in Denver. Questions about land rights and marriage validity. Nothing official yet, just inquiries. He looked at them both. But I can tell you right now, they won't go anywhere. Your marriage is legal, witnessed, and recorded. And this land, you filed a homestead claim, right? 14 years ago, Caleb confirmed. Then it's yours. Nobody can take that away based on some dead man's brother saying otherwise. Hendricks pulled out a sheaf of papers. That said, we should make everything ironclad. I'll file additional documentation, get everything certified and sealed. It'll cost you a bit, but it'll protect you. Whatever it takes, Lydia said. They spent 3 days in town, getting every piece of paper filed, signed, and notarized. Morrison vouched for them, as did several other townspeople who'd gotten to know them over the past year. By the time they were done, their claim to the land and each other was documented 6 ways from Sunday. One more thing, Judge Hendricks said on the 3rd day. That Marcus fellow. You have any proof he threatened you? Just our word, Caleb said. And mine, said a voice from the doorway. They turned to find Marcus's former companion standing there, hat in hand. Name's Robert Chen. I was hired by Marcus Vale to help him track down his brother's widow. He told me it was a family matter, that she'd run off with something that belonged to him. But when we got up to your place and I saw how things really were. He shook his head. That's not a family matter. That's obsession, and I want no part of it. You willing to testify to that? Hendricks asked. Already did. Gave a statement to the sheriff this morning. Everything Marcus said, everything he planned, it's all on record. Hendrik smiled. Then I'd say Mr. Vale's case just fell apart. And if he's smart, he'll stay far away from both of you from now on. They rode back up the mountain the next day, tired but triumphant. The cabin looked small and perfect in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney where they'd banked the fire before leaving. Home. We did it, Lydia said. We did. Think Marcus will actually give up? He doesn't have a choice now. If he comes after us again, he's the one who'll end up in jail. Caleb squeezed her hand. It's over. Really over. Spring that year came early and stayed late, like the world was apologizing for the harsh winter. The garden exploded into life, producing more than they could eat and requiring a whole new section of the cabin for storage. The chickens started laying regularly, giving them fresh eggs almost daily. And in late May, Lydia stood in the doorway of the cabin looking out at the clearing and said, "We should build bigger." "The cabin's fine," Caleb said. "It's fine for 2 people. But what if there were more?" He looked at her sharply. "Are you?" "Not yet, but maybe someday. And if that someday comes, we'll need more room." She turned to him, her expression hopeful and nervous. "Would you want that? A family?" Caleb thought about it, about everything they'd built, everything they'd survived, about the life they'd carved out of this mountain through sheer determination and love. "Yeah," he said. "I'd want that. Even knowing I lost one before, that there's no guarantee, especially knowing that, because it means you're brave enough to try again. And I want to be there with you when you do." She kissed him, and it tasted like possibility. They spent that summer building an addition to the cabin, a proper bedroom separate from the main room, with space for a cradle if they needed it. They expanded the garden again, added a small root cellar for storage, and built a better coop for the chickens that could handle expansion if they got more. In August, Lydia missed her monthly bleeding. She didn't say anything at first, too scared to hope, but when she missed the second one, she told Caleb. "It might not stick," she warned him. "It might not work. And it might be fine. We'll take it as it comes." They did. Carefully, nervously, hopefully. Lydia modified her work as her belly grew, and Caleb took on more of the heavy tasks. They made plans for the winter, stocked extra supplies, prepared for the possibility that they might need to get to town quickly if complications arose. But the pregnancy held. Through September and October and into November, as winter settled in again, Lydia's belly grew round and full of life. "I'm terrified," she admitted one night. "Me too. What if something goes wrong?" "Then we handle it, together, like everything else." She took his hand, placed it on her stomach. Caleb felt a kick, strong, determined, alive. "That's our kid," he said, wonder in his voice. "That's our kid," Lydia agreed. The baby came in early March during a snowstorm that would have prevented any trip to town even if they'd wanted to make one. Caleb delivered his own daughter with shaking hands and Lydia's guidance, and when the baby finally slipped free and took her first breath, he felt something in his chest crack wide open. "She's perfect," he breathed. "Let me see her." He placed the baby, tiny, red, squalling, on Lydia's chest. His wife looked down at their daughter with an expression of fierce love and profound relief. "We did it," she whispered. "You did it." "We did it?" They named her Sarah, after the wife Caleb had lost, and Emma, after Lydia's mother. Sarah Emma Rourke came into the world screaming and didn't stop for 3 hours, but neither of them minded. She was alive. They were alive. And that was enough. The years that followed were hard but good. Sarah grew into a wild-haired toddler who loved the chickens and learned to walk by chasing them around the yard. They had 2 more children, a boy named Daniel in 1875 and another girl, Grace, in 1877. The cabin expanded again, then again, until it was barely recognizable as the simple structure Caleb had built 14 years before. The garden became a small farm. The 3 chickens became 20. They got a cow, then 2. Caleb built a proper barn to hold it all. And Lydia, fierce, determined Lydia, built a life that was everything she'd dreamed about during those dark days in St. Louis. In the spring of 1880, they made their annual trip to town with all 3 kids in tow. The town had grown too, new families settling in, new businesses opening up. But the biggest change was in how people looked at them. Not as the hermit and the woman he'd saved, but as the Rourkes, a family. part of the community. "You two have done well," Morrison said, watching the kids tear around the store while Lydia tried to keep them from breaking anything. "Who would have thought that winter day 8 years ago when you walked in here together?" "Not me," Caleb admitted. "Best decision you ever made, though, right?" Caleb watched Lydia laugh at something Sarah said, saw the way she'd relaxed into herself over the years, how the fear that used to haunt her eyes had been replaced with confidence and joy. He watched his kids, healthy, happy, wild as the mountain they lived on, and felt something like gratitude. "Yeah," he said, "best decision I ever made." That evening, after the kids were asleep and they were lying in bed in the room they'd added to the boarding house, Lydia said, "Do you ever regret it?" "Regret what?" "This life. The mountain. Me. All of it. Do you ever wish you'd stayed alone?" Caleb pulled her closer. "Not once, not for a single second. Even when the kids are screaming and the chickens are escaping and everything's chaos?" "Especially then, because that chaos means life. Real life. The kind I'd given up on before you showed up." He kissed her temple. "You saved me, Lydia, just as much as I saved you." "We saved each other." "Yeah, we did." They fell asleep like that, tangled together, while outside the mountain stood silent and eternal. The same mountain that had been Caleb's refuge from pain had become the foundation for his joy. The same isolation that had protected him from hurt had transformed into the space where he'd learned to live again. And it had all started with one frozen morning, one stubborn woman, and one decision to offer help when every instinct said to walk away. Years later, when people asked Caleb about his life, and they did, as his family grew and thrived and became something of a legend in those parts, he'd tell them the truth. That he'd spent 14 years dying slowly in these mountains, convinced that survival was enough. That he'd been wrong. And that the day he'd found Lydia sitting on those steps, refusing to beg and too proud to quit, was the day he'd started living again. "So what's the moral?" someone asked him once, a young man from back east who'd come west looking for adventure. Caleb thought about it while he watched his grandkids, because, yes, Sarah had married and had kids of her own by then, play in the yard that had once been just wilderness. "The moral," he said, "is that sometimes the thing you think will complicate your life is exactly what you need to save it. And that being alone isn't the same as being safe. Sometimes the biggest risk you can take is letting someone in." "That's it?" "That's everything." The young man left, probably disappointed by the simplicity of it. But Caleb didn't care. He'd lived it, learned it, built a life on the truth of it. And watching his family, children and grandchildren and Lydia, still fierce and stubborn and beautiful even with gray in her hair, he knew he'd gotten it right. The frontier had been brutal. The winters had been hard. The threats had been real. But in the end, two broken people had found each other in the wilderness and built something that lasted. Not because it was easy, but because they'd both been stubborn enough to try. And that, Caleb figured, was as close to a happy ending as anyone could hope for.